Hello everyone, and welcome to this keynote address for the 6th International Conference on Economic Management and Green Development at Stanford University. My talk today will be on building resilience in essential industries. So basically the first half of the talk will be on resilience definitions and how we can build resilience, and then the second half will be how we can do so in essential industries. It will be a step-by-step guideline that is being introduced for the first time here. Now, the picture that you see here is particularly designed for the purpose of this talk because, as you can see, the cornerstone is replaced by a human head, which is what I'm going to explain today, how human judgment and human expert opinion can be used for building resilience in our global economy. Let us start with some basic definitions. What is a supply chain? Supply chains are networks of firms involved in the processing, basically transforming materials into final products, and then those final products to be distributed to eventually reach the consumers. The participating firms in a supply chains could be suppliers, material suppliers, it could be component suppliers, raw material suppliers, there are manufacturers, there are logistic providers, and there are wholesalers and retailers. Now, today's supply chains are truly global because these firms could be located anywhere in the world. Wesfarmers in Australia, which is one of the larger multi-brand corporations in Australia, they operate in 40 countries and with 3,000 plus suppliers. So you can see how this complex network of economic interdependencies of today makes it very difficult to manage supply chains. Now, part of the issue here is risk management. Because you operate in various locations, you are very much exposed to various risks. Disruptions can occur in any part of supply chain. The usual outcome of disruptions is multiple basically things can happen, but usually what occurs is a supply shortage, lost sales, could be reputational damage, and sometimes even business closure. Now, you've seen with COVID-19 how unprepared our supply chains in general are. And we've had shortage of everything, basically all household items, most household items, and particularly in particular stores and particular brands were more affected. But some of the recent executive data is showing that only 2% of companies were really fully prepared for the pandemic, and 70% reported some sort of disruption and negative impact on their supply chains within the year one only. Now, part of this issue is our focus on cost minimization. We particularly tend to minimize cost, and we love lean practices as such, which means no duplication, no waste, basically be as lean as possible, which is very much anti-risk management conceptually. So there is less focus on resilience building as such. I mean, even though the academic literature is very well developed in this domain, but industry has really focused particularly on cost minimization, which does make sense to some people who really focus on lean practices, but in general, this trend must be stopped. Now we know that this has to be corrected, and COVID proved that to us, that having resilient supply chains is essential to our global and national economy and security. But what do we mean by risk management? And what do we mean by resilience in general? Let us get some definitions here. We talk about disruptions versus interruptions. They're not the same concepts. I mean, definition-wise, interruptions are more frequent, but not very destructive to the supply chain. But then disruptions are less frequent, but when they happen, they have a large impact on supply chains. A good example of it is COVID-19, which disrupts entire supply chain operations. But an interruption could be any fluctuations in demand and supply, which is not necessarily stopping the operations of the entire supply chain, but it does interrupt your operations. Now, definition-wise, when we talk about different types of risks, the most common definition is an internal risk versus external risk. Now, what is an internal risk? Internal risks are usually easier to mitigate because they are under full control of the business. A good example of this is a quality management problem. So for example, if you've got an item that is being produced not within the standards of the business or industry, then what you can do, you can just use a tighter process control to just make sure that the quality control is just better implemented so you get better products out of it. But this is not always the case because there are external risks that have the problem of being not under the control of the firm. So pandemics, for example, a trade war, for example, weather events, for example, like a flood, for example, in a particular region of the world will affect your supply. It's not really within your control. And the impact is quite catastrophic on supply chains. Our focus today is more on external risks. So we don't worry much about the internal risk because this is an operational thing that companies can control on their own. We focus on external risks. There are certain ways of mitigating external risks. Some of the more common approaches are diversifying supply base. And with this, we mean like increasing the number and location of your suppliers and facilities so that a single event will not affect all entities at the same time and to the same magnitude, right? So you are diversifying your operations, the locations of your facilities and suppliers. Now, the other approach that people have used in industry is building domestic capabilities. So basically, it is to keep some of your operations in-house to ensure that business can still continue operations when disruptions occur in your suppliers' sites. Another method is the stockpiling, more relevant to governments, for example. So that is basically to accumulate a large stock of goods or materials to deal with unexpected supply chain disruptions if massive disruptions occur, like COVID-19. Another approach is sustainable development. Basically, you invest in the operations of your suppliers to make sure that their negative or their bad sustainability performance will not affect your reputation and will not affect your operations in any way. So their poor environmental and social sustainability performance basically is mitigated through your investments in their operations. Now the question is, if we know these strategies and we are aware of these methods, so why is it that we are still performing so poorly in the face of disruptions? There is a strong reason for this. There is a very solid reason, and that is, it's not economically viable to invest on everything. You must choose what you invest in. Now, for example, we all know that having multiple suppliers is better than having a single supplier. Why is it? Well, because multi-sourcing means that you can just have multiple suppliers in different locations. If anything happens to one, the other ones can pick up the slack and just the operations will still continue, right? But this is costly as well because you can't take advantage of quantity discount anymore. You don't have a single supplier to maintain and just give all the business to them and just make sure that you get it at a better price. And then also there is a cost of monitoring the performance of those suppliers. So you can see that you need a trade-off. And this trade-off is basically to know what number of suppliers is the optimal in my case. And that only is valid to you, not to any other business. So businesses, in this case, need systematic cost-benefit trade-offs. And this is all to identify where to invest. basically. What methods are more relevant to you? This is even more important for our essential industries. Why do we care more about essential industries? Essential goods and services are the ones that are critical to our national and global economic functions. So basically, it's got to do with the well-being of our people. It's got to do with our national and global security. Things such as water, things such as food, things such as essential supplies on a daily basis. You can't discontinue this stuff, right? So you can't treat them the same as you're treating, for example, a cleaning item. I mean, whether they're available or not for a while, it doesn't kill us. But there are items and services that they could be actually having a lot to do with our well-being. The supply chain of those items, which we consider to be essential goods and services, is considered to be essential supply chains. Now the question is, how can we systematically identify supply chain risks for essential industries? And then how can we mitigate them? This is the rest of my talk from now. Now, let us go through this by step-by-step procedure. Step one, you're gonna have to identify your essential industries. Essential industries do vary from one country to another, from one region to another. So for example, in Australia, we have done a sort of analysis, and this is, as you can see here, there are 8 categories of essential goods and services in Australia. Data for this kind of analysis can come from various sources. So for example, here, data was collected from the classifications of Critical Infrastructure Centre, the Essential Services Act, for example, in various states. And there is national reports by politicians and by scientific committees that we put them all together, and this is the outcome telling us what are the essential categories in Australia, essential items, essential services. Food and grocery, health, finance, energy, water, logistics, communications, and government services. So these are the categories that we do consider them to be essential industries. Now, what can we do about them? Step two. Step two tells us for each of those industries, you need to understand the risk appetite, risk tolerance, and risk threshold. This is what I termed as RAT. Risk appetite, tolerances, and thresholds. Now, let me explain what I mean by these terms one by one. As you can see, there is a human head here in the middle of the page, which means something, because all of these things that we're discussing today has got to do with human judgment and with human expert opinion in various disciplines. Therefore, this is step two, is to talk to experts in different fields, in different industries, to understand how they can define risk appetite, risk threshold, and the tolerances. Now let us go through each of these one by one, so I can tell you what we mean by risk appetite first. Risk appetite is the degree of risk an industry is willing to accept in anticipation of a reward. So basically, this is a measure, or a very subjective measure, that is telling us how much are you willing to pay for resilience in general in that particular industry. How risk averse are you? How much are you willing to put in to be more resilient? Then the next one is risk tolerances. This one is more detailed. So basically, for each type of risk and for each mitigation strategy to tackle that risk, what is your tolerance? How much are you willing to invest? Tolerance is basically the next level of detail, a more specific definition of risk appetite. And then there is risk threshold. The risk threshold is the bottom line, is the red line. You can't go beyond this. The whole industry will be destroyed if we do this. So I would say that risk appetite is the upper bound. How much are you willing to pay so you can still operate? The risk threshold is the lower bound that tells you, no, I can't do less than this. So this is the minimum that you're willing to invest, and this is the maximum that you're willing to invest. This is the best that you can ever be in terms of risk management. This is the worst that you can be. And risk tolerance will break this down into multiple layers and will tell you that how flexible you are against each of these. Now, let us go through this step 3. Step 3 will tell you, now that you know the rat, now that you know that what is the appetite and tolerance and threshold of each industry, let us build a framework that can tell me the preferences and priorities of each of those 8 industries. So the framework precisely explains the upper and lower bounds and the tolerances of each industry very specifically for each risk mitigation method. So what methods are more applicable to you? And for each of those methods, what are your tolerances? What are your priorities? How much are you willing to put in for each of those? So you can see this is a rather conceptual framework, but it's very practical as well. So it's got to do with practice because it's informed by industry, but at the same time, it's still conceptual because it hasn't been tested. Now, there is also step 4. Step 4 tells us, now, so what? We have this framework. What is it used for? Step 4 will use models to prescribe risk mitigation methods. So here we use the framework from step 3. We use that same framework to make risk mitigation decisions. How do we make decisions? Here is analytical models and decision support tools. There are multiple ways of doing this, but there are multiple methods, analytical models and methods available to do this, but basically the outcome will be customized risk mitigation prescriptions. We call this like actionable insights. These are insights from the model that industry can rely on because it's very systematically recommended. Now, if you look at just for me to give you a bit of more details about these tools and methods, this slide will tell you how these actionable insights are produced. Basically, what is happening is we use operational data from industry, which is quite large, as you can tell, and we develop risk mitigation scenarios. So, for example, we develop random disruptions to a supply chain, and we repeat these scenarios multiple times in various forms, disrupt multiple facilities in different combinations, and then we compare the outcomes of each scenario. And then what we do, we use different mitigation methods to see how an industry can perform better under each of those scenarios. So this is a scenario-based analysis. Now, you can see such model building is quite complex. This is a mathematical thing, and I don't want to go through details of this, but there are dynamic programming methods that are used for modeling supply chains. We use dynamic programming for a reason, because the nature of supply chains is dynamic, and the nature of disruptions is also dynamic. So a supply chain faces variations in demand, in supply, and changes in production capacity, in supply capacity. So this is completely dynamic by nature. And then disruptions are also dynamic because you don't even know the probability of a disruption occurrence. You don't even know what sort of impact it will have on your supply chain. So therefore, the whole thing is also is actually dynamic. Therefore, you have to use dynamic methods to model that dynamic system. Now, once this is modeled, you want to develop scenarios. Therefore, this is a simulation approach. So we use simulation models to develop multiple scenarios and to develop multiple disruptions and apply those disruptions to those models and see what actually happens into supply chains, because we can't wait for COVID to come and affect our supply chains. We can simulate this and understand how and in what magnitude this impact will affect our national economy and security. Now, for these, this is where the application of artificial intelligence comes up. And this is a very good application of them because there are a number of scenarios. So you're talking about big data analytics. There are so many scenarios that you need to develop, and there are so many outcomes, and there are so many comparisons. So you can see this is quite a complex part of the whole mechanism. Now, this is step 4, has outcomes that are very useful. For example, the first outcome of this step 4 for these models to be produced is for our industries to become more resilient. So our essential industries, with the use of this systematic approach of risk mitigation, they will know where to invest. They will know how to minimize the impact of future disruptions on their operations. And then at the same time, our governments will be also stronger. Why? Because they can make more informed policy decisions. They can provide adequate information to our industry if they want them to take care of their own risk. And at the same time, they can take the ownership of some of the risk management, so the governments I'm saying, because some items or some services are just very essential to our national economy or our security, then the governments can step in and they take the direct ownership of certain risk management, so to help our industry to also be informed that the government is backing them. But without these models, it's almost impossible for governments to know where they should invest, who they should help, right? So this sort of approach and this model, I believe, is necessary for every country, for every government, and for every industry. We haven't been thinking about these things in the past, hence our experience with COVID-19 is not a pleasant one, right? Let us do this because the magnitude and the frequency of these disruptions is going to increase. We can't really be in a better situation, at least for a few decades from now. The situation only gets worse. Now, there is one last slide that I prepared because I want to put a particular emphasis on sustainability-related risks, which is particularly relevant to the theme of this conference being on green development. And I think one of the issues that we today really face in our industry is that environmental and social obligations are completely ignored when industries are struggling with their day-to-day operational job. So you can't really ask them much about sustainability reports when they can't even survive, right? And the problem is that sustainability-related risks are not incorporated into their risk mitigation like a class or category of risks, which is what it should be, right? So investment in sustainable development really should be part of any risk assessment and risk management. And this is not really to avoid reputational damage as such. It is actually a strong business case for business continuity. None of us can operate in an environment where we constantly face disruptions in terms of both number of disruptions and the magnitude of disruptions. And therefore, it is essential to really incorporate this category of risk, which is sustainability-related risks, into that framework of step 3. Well, it should have been there in the past, but we just ignored it. And this is time for us to rethink our risk mitigation strategies. And on that note, I'll finish my talk today. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask now, or you can always reach out to me by just Googling my name. Thank you, everybody.